A cop tries to remove a black woman from the courtroom, then a call from the White House turns everything upside down. "Ma'am, you need to leave. Now." The officer's sharp command cut through the thick tension in the room. Natalie Vaughn stood firm, clutching her legal documents as murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I have the right to be here," she said, her voice steady, her stance unshaken. The judge's gavel slammed down. "Not anymore. Bailiff, remove her." Sergeant Damon Whitmore stepped forward, ready to force her out. But just as he reached for her, the courtroom doors burst open. A breathless clerk rushed in, waving a folded note. "Your Honor," she gasped, her voice trembling, "there's a call from the White House." A stunned silence swept over the courtroom. The judge froze. The officer halted mid-step. And in that instant, Natalie knew the tide had turned. Everything was about to change. Before we unravel this jaw-dropping mystery, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you love shocking true stories, don't forget to subscribe. Rain fell in slow, deliberate sheets over the quiet D.C. suburb, turning driveways into silver mirrors and trees into black silhouettes swaying with silent urgency. Inside a modest brick townhouse tucked between two towering maples, Natalie Vaughn stood at her kitchen window, her reflection rippling in the rain-streaked glass. The kettle hissed behind her, but she didn't move. She was too focused, too still. Today wasn't just another court date, it was the day. Her day to confront the corporation that had tried to erase her, to silence the truth. She had barely slept, her mind a spinning wheel of timelines, email threads, legal strategy, and the faces of those who had doubted her for far too long. On the table behind her sat a meticulously organized binder of evidence, its corners frayed from constant handling. Above it, a photograph of Natalie and her daughter Maya, smiling wide under a summer sun, stared out like a reminder of all that was at stake. "Nervous?" Maya asked from the doorway, wrapped in her favorite hoodie, a tablet tucked under her arm. She was only 13, but sharp. Too sharp sometimes. Natalie turned and smiled faintly, pushing aside the weight in her chest. "More than I want to admit," she confessed, reaching for her coffee mug. "But we've come too far to stop now." Maya patted over and handed her a small object, a tarnished pendant in the shape of a feather. "For luck. Grandma used to say feathers carry the weight of truth, even when no one listens." Natalie's breath caught. The pendant had once been hers, passed down from her own mother, a civil rights organizer who taught her to speak, even when her voice trembled. She clutched it tightly. "Thank you, baby. I'll carry it with me." Outside, the storm worsened, thunder rumbling like distant judgment. As Natalie pulled on her raincoat and stepped into the gray morning, the sky seemed to press down, the clouds heavy with warning. The drive to the courthouse was tense, the windshield wipers slicing rhythmically through the downpour. She passed the polished headquarters of Argento Strategies, the political consulting firm that had fired her a year earlier under the guise of restructuring. But she knew the truth. She had uncovered a pattern of racially biased messaging strategies buried in internal campaigns. When she brought it up, she was dismissed, both literally and figuratively. The courthouse loomed ahead, surrounded by a growing crowd of reporters sheltered under umbrellas. Something was already stirring. Word had leaked about the sensitive nature of her case. She wasn't just challenging a firm, she was challenging a powerful institution with friends in high places. The storm outside mirrored the one within. She parked the car, took a final breath, and stepped out into the rain, gripping her binder like a shield. As she approached the courthouse steps, a flash of lightning illuminated a figure standing at the doors. Sergeant Damon Whitmore, watching her approach with unreadable eyes. There was no mistaking it. He had been waiting. For her. A chill crawled up Natalie's spine, and for a moment she hesitated, wondering not just what she was walking into, but who might be waiting to shut her down from the inside. The storm, it seemed, was only just beginning. The courthouse rose from the slick pavement like a monolith, cold, towering, indifferent. Its granite columns glistened with rain, and the flags outside its entrance whipped in the wind, snapping like warnings. Natalie Vaughn stood at the curb, staring up at the building that would decide whether her voice would be heard or silenced again. She drew her coat tighter, rain streaking down her cheeks like the echo of old tears. All around her, the city buzzed with its usual chaos. Horns blaring, pedestrians huddled under umbrellas. But for Natalie, everything felt muted, as if the world had dimmed to sharpen the focus on this singular moment. She inhaled, braced herself, and stepped toward the courthouse entrance. The security perimeter was unusually tense. Uniformed officers flanked the metal detectors, with more scrutiny than usual, their eyes scanning every face that entered. Rumors had swirled online that a federal corruption case involving a sitting senator was being heard in the same building today. But Natalie couldn't help but feel the weight of every gaze that lingered just a second too long on her. She wasn't just another litigant walking in. Her case had already stirred quiet controversy. The kind of case that made powerful people sweat behind closed doors. She approached the security checkpoint, clutching her evidence binder with knuckles pale from tension. A young officer motioned her forward without speaking, but just as she began to unload her bag, another voice sliced through the air. "Hold up, I'll take this one." The officer stepped aside as Sergeant Damon Whitmore approached, his presence magnetic and unsettling all at once. Broad-shouldered and immaculately groomed, he moved like someone used to being obeyed. His gaze landed on Natalie. Cool, professional, unreadable. "You're Ms. Vaughn," he said, more as a statement than a question. Natalie didn't flinch. "I am." He nodded slowly, eyes flicking down to the binder. "You're here for room 4B. Judge Sinclair." "I know," she replied, refusing to let her voice betray the undercurrent of dread climbing her spine. A beat passed between them, thick, electric. Something in Whitmore's posture and the way his hand rested near his holstered belt felt less like protection and more like surveillance, like he wasn't just ensuring safety, but expecting trouble. "Follow the signs to the elevators," he said finally, stepping aside. "Courtroom's on the 3rd floor." Natalie nodded, but as she passed, she caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it recognition, caution, or worse, an unspoken warning? Inside the courthouse was a maze of marble and whispers. Lawyers whispered urgently into phones. Clerks dashed between chambers. Screens displayed courtroom assignments like departures at a train station. Natalie found herself alone in the elevator, staring at her reflection in the brushed metal wall. The pendant around her neck glinted softly, the only piece of her mother she had left. She touched it once, for strength, and the doors slid open with a hollow ding. The 3rd floor was quieter, eerily so. The hallway leading to room 4B was long, sterile, humming faintly with fluorescent light. Natalie took slow steps forward, each one echoing louder than the last. She felt eyes, judging, curious, or waiting, in every shadow. Just as she reached the heavy wooden doors, they creaked open from the inside. Her attorney, Travis Monroe, stepped out. His face was tense, but when he saw her, it softened with a mix of relief and urgency. "You're right on time," he said, "but something's off." They moved up the schedule. No explanation. Natalie frowned. "You think they're trying to rush it?" Travis didn't answer. He just opened the door wider and motioned her in. "Whatever it is," he said under his breath, "we need to be ready." And with that, Natalie stepped into the courtroom, unaware that this day would not unfold the way anyone expected. The courtroom was a study in stillness, the kind of silence that thrums with hidden tension. Dark-paneled walls towered overhead, and the long wooden benches gleamed under the recessed lights like pews in a chapel built not for prayer, but for judgment. Natalie Vaughn stepped into room 4B with her binder clutched to her chest, the heels of her boots clicking against the polished floor like a metronome counting down to something irreversible. At the front of the room, beneath the crest of the state and a pair of crossed flags, loomed Judge Margot Sinclair, already seated, already watching. Sinclair had a reputation. Elegant, severe, and sharp as cut glass, she was known throughout D.C. legal circles for her intolerance of theatrics and her notoriously short fuse. Her high collar framed a narrow face of stone, framed by silver-streaked hair swept tightly into a bun. Her eyes were piercing, like a hawk's, always circling for weakness. She did not lean back in her chair. She sat upright, still as a statue, her gavel already in hand as if daring someone to make her use it. Natalie's breath caught as their eyes met. She felt the judge's scrutiny like a weight pressing into her sternum. Not curiosity, not even skepticism. Appraisal, calculation. Her attorney, Travis Monroe, moved swiftly to the plaintiff's table and whispered, "Don't let her demeanor throw you. Just stick to what we rehearsed." Natalie nodded but didn't respond. Her eyes never left the judge. Something in Sinclair's gaze unsettled her. Not just authority, but something colder, something personal. The opposing counsel, a well-tailored man with slicked-back hair and a predator's smile, gave Natalie a smug once-over as he organized his papers. He oozed the confidence of someone who believed the game was already rigged in his favor. Natalie recognized the look. She had seen it too many times in boardrooms, in performance reviews, in the half-smirks of men who dismissed her with a glance. Judge Sinclair cleared her throat, and just that sound was enough to silence the room. "Court is now in session," she announced, her voice clear, crisp, and emotionless. "Ms. Vaughn, Mr. Monroe, you may proceed with your opening." As Travis stood and began laying out the framework of Natalie's case, outlining the wrongful termination and the pattern of racial bias within Argento strategies, the judge barely reacted. Her pen moved across her notepad in precise, clinical strokes. No questions, no interruptions. Just a long, slow narrowing of her eyes when Travis mentioned the encrypted internal emails Natalie had recovered. Emails suggesting that racial profiling wasn't just a byproduct of Argento's political strategies, but part of the model itself. When Natalie finally took the stand, she felt like she was walking into a lion's den. She spoke calmly at first, detailing her experience, her job performance, her discovery of discriminatory practices. But as she referenced specific names, policies, and documents, the judge's demeanor shifted slightly, a flicker of impatience, a glance to the bailiff. Opposing counsel objected repeatedly, and each time Sinclair sustained it without hesitation. Then, just as Natalie prepared to submit her key evidence, a data trail linking Argento's policy shifts to internal racial profiling memos, Judge Sinclair raised a hand. "You've made your point, Ms. Vaughn," she said coolly. "Let's not turn this courtroom into a crusade." The words struck like ice. A murmur rose from the gallery. Natalie froze. Travis began to speak in protest, but Sinclair's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "One more outburst or deviation from protocol," she warned, "and I will have you removed." The air thickened. Natalie felt it, the shifting of the ground beneath her case, and something else, a rising sense that someone, somewhere, wanted her silenced before she got any closer to the truth. Natalie Vaughn could feel it, the walls closing in inch by inch with every objection sustained, every pointed look from Judge Margot Sinclair, and every smirk from the opposing counsel that suggested he already knew how this would end. She sat upright on the witness stand, hands folded over the edge, her voice steady, but threaded with quiet urgency. Her testimony had begun with careful composure, but now as she attempted to introduce the crucial new evidence, a string of internal emails leaked just days earlier, everything teetered on the edge of unraveling. She held the printed copies in her hand, each page laced with veiled language about image concerns, urban optics, and other coded phrases used to justify freezing her out of leadership roles. Pages that could destroy Argento Strategy's defense. Pages that had already started circulating among journalists and watchdog groups, albeit anonymously. But here inside the courtroom, they still didn't officially exist, not unless the judge allowed them in. "I'm asking the court to review these documents," Natalie said, lifting them slightly. "They were obtained legally, and they're directly relevant to—" "That's enough, Ms. Vaughn," Judge Sinclair interrupted sharply, eyes narrowing. "We've already heard your testimony." "But, Your Honor—" Travis Monroe stood quickly, his tone still respectful, but firm. "This evidence only came to light this week. We're prepared to authenticate—" "I said enough," Sinclair snapped, gavel slamming down hard, the sound cracking through the courtroom like thunder. Gasps rippled through the gallery, but Natalie remained frozen. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she held firm. "I have the right to present a full defense," she said, her voice rising for the first time. "Not if you continue to violate courtroom procedure." The judge's tone chilled. She turned to the bailiff, then nodded to the rear of the room. "Remove her from the courtroom." For a moment, time stopped. Natalie's blood turned to ice as she watched Sergeant Damon Whitmore step forward, his expression unreadable, posture all authority and protocol. He moved with measured purpose, walking down the aisle toward her, his presence suddenly immense. "Ma'am," he said quietly but firmly, "you need to come with me." Travis jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, please, this is an overreaction. My client is under pressure," she meant no disrespect. But Sinclair didn't respond. She simply tapped the gavel again and looked away, as if she were already finished with Natalie Vaughn. Natalie stood slowly, holding her binder to her chest like a shield, her dignity wrapped in frayed professionalism. She looked up at Whitmore, who gently but firmly placed a hand on her arm. A subtle gesture, but one with the weight of centuries behind it. As she was led down the aisle, murmurs broke out. Some whispered in sympathy, others leaned back, smug and satisfied. To them, she had overstepped, to become too emotional, too assertive. Natalie's heart thudded with fury and fear. She was being escorted out not because she disrupted the court, but because she was close to something they didn't want exposed. Outside the doors, the storm still raged, and inside, something far more dangerous had just been set in motion. The door slammed shut behind her with a cold, vis-echoing finality, and Natalie Vaughn found herself standing alone in the sterile, too-bright hallway of the courthouse, exiled from the very space where she had come to demand justice. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of indignation. The binder in her arms felt suddenly heavier, like a coffin for all the truths she had worked so hard to bring into the light. Her shoulders sagged, but she refused to let the tears burning behind her eyes fall. Not here, not where they'd see, not where they'd win. She moved to a bench tucked in a far corner near the frosted glass windows. The world outside smeared by rain and judgment. The hallway buzzed with distant voices and the muffled clatter of shoes, but no one acknowledged her. She may as well have been invisible, a woman erased in plain sight. A few minutes later, Sergeant Damon Whitmore appeared at the end of the corridor, clipboard in hand, his boots hitting the floor like metronomic reminders of who held the power here. Natalie stiffened instinctively as he approached. For a long, tense moment he said nothing. Then, in a tone just slightly less sharp than before, he spoke. "Look," he said, glancing around, then back at her. "You put me in a tough spot. The judge gave an order. I followed it." Natalie raised her eyes to him slowly. "You didn't have to grab me like I was a threat," she said. Her voice was steady but cold. "I'm not a criminal, Sergeant." Whitmore's jaw tightened, and for a flicker of a second something like regret passed over his face. "I don't make the rules," he muttered, eyes shifting away. "I just enforce them." "Then maybe you should ask yourself what kind of rules you're helping enforce." Her words landed with precision, and though Whitmore didn't respond, his silence was telling. The moment stretched. Natalie turned away, gripping the binder tighter. Her heart ached, not just from the humiliation of being removed from her own hearing, but from the suffocating sense that the system had never been built to hear her at all. She had played by every rule, followed every channel, prepared every document down to the comma, and still it hadn't been enough. One outburst, one moment of passion, and she was cast out as disruptive. Minutes ticked by like hours. Her phone buzzed, but it wasn't Travis. No updates, no rescue, just static on the other end of justice. She tried to replay what had gone wrong, to think if there was a better way she could have handled it, but deep down she knew. This wasn't about decorum. It was about silencing a woman who had come too close to a truth that powerful people didn't want exposed. The door at the far end opened again. Another court clerk rushed by, oblivious to her, as if Natalie were nothing more than a shadow on the bench. And yet, she remained. Drenched in humiliation, wrapped in the bitter ache of injustice, she still sat upright. She would not leave. She would not run. Because something inside her whispered that this story wasn't over yet. Inside Courtroom 4B, the atmosphere had shifted from controlled tension to barely concealed chaos. Travis Monroe stood alone at the plaintiff's table, eyes burning with fury, voice taut with urgency as he addressed Judge Margot Sinclair. "Your Honor, the suppression of that evidence is not just unjust, it may be unlawful. My client's entire case hinges on documents that demonstrate a clear pattern of racial bias, and you've denied her the right to present them." His voice echoed through the silent chamber, landing like a challenge at the judge's feet. Judge Sinclair didn't respond immediately. Her stony expression remained unreadable as she shuffled papers and adjusted her glasses, giving no indication that she was moved or even listening. The opposing counsel leaned back, oozing self-satisfaction, his pen tapping rhythmically against his notepad like a metronome, marking the moments until this would all be swept away. But before Sinclair could bang the gavel again and reassert her dominance, the courtroom doors burst open. Everyone turned. A court clerk, face flushed, breath ragged, strode quickly to the bench, clutching an envelope sealed in red wax. She leaned in to whisper urgently into the judge's ear. Sinclair's brow twitched, her body stiffened. Whatever she heard did not sit easily. "This is highly irregular," she muttered, her voice caught between surprise and alarm. "Where did this come from?" the clerk whispered again, glancing nervously around the courtroom. "Direct from the Federal Circuit Liaison's office. There's a call waiting on the secure line from the Department of Justice." At the mention of those words, spoken just loudly enough to be heard by a few, the energy in the courtroom fractured. A hushed murmur spread among the observers and legal aides. The smug confidence on the opposing counsel's face faltered for the first time that morning. Travis's heart jumped. Something seismic was happening. Sinclair stood abruptly, folding the envelope with rigid hands. "This court is in recess for 15 minutes, she announced. "All parties are to remain in the vicinity." Her voice was curt now, her usual composure faltering as she gathered her robes and swept toward her chambers. The gavel strike sounded like a cannon shot as she exited the bench. The moment she vanished behind the door, the courtroom exploded into a flurry of speculation. "What kind of call?" a clerk whispered. "Did someone from the White House actually intervene?" murmured a junior associate near the back. Travis remained frozen at the table, trying to piece together what had just occurred. The DOJ? The Federal Circuit? Could someone at the national level have taken notice of Natalie's case? Had the documents already made it further up the ladder than they realized? He glanced at the empty seat where Natalie should have been and clenched his fists. Whatever was happening behind those closed doors, it wasn't just courtroom politics anymore. The case had drawn attention far beyond Shady Grove, and justice, for once, might be getting impatient. Behind the tall oak door of her chambers, Judge Margot Sinclair stood stiffly at her desk, staring down at the secure landline phone as if it were a coiled snake. The call had come through within moments of receiving the envelope, directly from the office of the Deputy Attorney General. And now, as she listened to the low, clipped voice on the other end, the mask of judicial detachment she wore so well began to crack. Her spine straightened, her lips tightened. She murmured a string of respectful, "Yes, sir. Understood. I will comply," as her hand gripped the receiver so tightly her knuckles whitened. Across from her, Sergeant Damon Whitmore waited silently, summoned minutes earlier by a visibly shaken court clerk. He'd expected a simple disciplinary update, perhaps a follow-up on Natalie Vaughn's removal. But now, standing in the solemn wood-paneled chamber filled with law books and the scent of tension, he sensed this was something far beyond his usual purview. Judge Sinclair finally set the phone down as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. A silence hung heavy in the room before she looked up, eyes less cold than before, now shadowed by something he hadn't seen from her before: unease. "That was the Department of Justice," she said, her voice measured but laced with urgency. "The Deputy Attorney General himself." Whitmore blinked, barely concealing his surprise. "About the Vaughn case?" "Yes." Sinclair paused, choosing her words carefully. "It appears Miss Vaughn's removal from the courtroom has drawn attention at the highest levels. Someone very senior, has taken an interest. The DOJ is sending a liaison to monitor the remainder of the hearing." She crossed the room and pulled Natalie's file from her desk, flipping through pages without really reading them. Her tone shifted, quieter. "They were clear. If it appears that this court has acted to suppress legitimate claims of racial discrimination or retaliated against a plaintiff for asserting their rights, there will be consequences." The words hung in the air like a dropped match in dry grass. Whitmore folded his arms. "And what do you want me to do?" Her eyes met his, sharp again, but not as sure. "Find Miss Vaughn. Now escort her back into the courtroom with respect. No cuffs, no hostility. Make it clear she is to be heard. Fully." A pause. "Sergeant, I don't need to remind you. This is no longer a routine hearing. There are eyes on this now. Powerful ones. The kind that don't forget." Whitmore gave a stiff nod, but internally he reeled. Just this morning, Natalie Vaughn was being treated as a courtroom disruption, a liability. Now she was a plaintiff, with the Department of Justice at her back. As he exited the chambers, his boots echoing down the marble corridor, he couldn't help but feel the tide had turned, swift, unexpected, and possibly unstoppable. Whatever this case had stirred up, it was no longer just about one woman's testimony. It was about the system itself. And the system had been caught looking away. The corridor stretched out before Sergeant Damon Whitmore like a gauntlet, polished floors, watchful stairs, and walls that suddenly seemed too narrow for the weight of the moment. The judge's words echoed in his mind like distant thunder. Escort Miss Vaughn back. With respect, he'd heard his fair share of courtroom politics in his years on the job, but never had he been ordered to reverse course under pressure from the Department of Justice. And certainly not for someone like Natalie Vaughn, a woman he had just forcibly removed under gavel-struck orders. He hadn't expected to think twice about it, but now? Now the stakes had changed, and so had she in his eyes. He found her exactly where he left her, sitting alone near the hallway exit, her binder still clutched in her lap, her posture straight despite the storm she'd just endured. Her eyes flicked up as he approached, unreadable but steady. She didn't flinch, didn't rise, just waited. Her calm unnerved him more than any courtroom outburst. Whitmore stopped a few feet away, suddenly aware of how he must look, how he had looked, looming over her earlier, hand on her arm like she was some threat. He cleared his throat, uncertain for the first time in a long while. "Ms. Vaughn," he said, quieter than before, "you're being asked to return to the courtroom." She blinked. "Asked?" Her voice was cool, not mocking, more like testing the truth in his tone. He nodded once. "Judge Sinclair wants you back. The hearing's resuming. Full testimony, full evidence." She didn't move, and he didn't blame her. The last time she'd stood, it was to be dragged out. "What changed?" she asked, brow raised. Whitmore hesitated, weighing what he could say. The official version? The sanitized one? Or something closer to the truth? "There's been interest from people higher up," he said finally. "Washington, the DOJ. Your case isn't just yours anymore." Natalie stared at him, eyes narrowing. "So now I'm worth listening to." He looked away briefly. "I didn't see the whole picture earlier," he admitted. "I saw someone pushing back and I was trained to respond. But that doesn't make it right." Silence stretched between them again, this time heavier. Finally she rose, still holding her binder, still composed. "Then let's go," she said. "But know this, Sergeant. Respect isn't something you get to offer when it's convenient. It's something you should have had from the beginning." He nodded, absorbing the words like a bruise. "Understood." As they walked side by side through the hallway, past curious stares and quiet whispers, Whitmore felt a shift in his own steps. Something was unraveling, not just the case, but the illusion he had clung to for years. That neutrality was safety. That following orders meant doing right. But now, as the elevator doors opened to return them to the courtroom, he understood something new. Sometimes justice demands more than obedience. It demands conscience. When Natalie Vaughn stepped back into courtroom 4B, the air felt different, charged humming with a silent current of anticipation. The same space that had rejected her just an hour earlier now watched her with something closer to awe, or maybe unease. The gallery, once half empty, was now quietly full. Word had spread. A White House-connected call. DOJ oversight. Something had shifted in the shadows of power, and Natalie could feel it in every glance, every tightened jaw. Sergeant Damon Whitmore escorted her to her table without a word, his demeanor far more solemn than before. As she sat, Travis Monroe leaned in with a hushed whisper, eyes wide with barely concealed adrenaline. "They got spooked, That call hit hard. Sinclair's been briefed by the DOJ rep. He's in the building somewhere." Natalie blinked, absorbing the whiplash of it all. Moments ago she was being walked out in humiliation. Now she was being welcomed back like the center of a political firestorm. Her heart thudded, not just with anxiety, but with a strange flicker of hope. The truth might finally have room to breathe. At the bench, Judge Margot Sinclair returned, her robe swaying behind her like a warning flag. She took her seat and adjusted her glasses with deliberate care, but something in her poise had shifted, no less controlled but palpably less cold. She tapped her gavel once. "Let the record reflect that the court is resuming its hearing on Vaughn versus Argento strategies." Her voice was calm, though slightly strained. "Due to recent developments, this court has decided to allow the submission of new evidence previously withheld." Gasps fluttered from the back of the room like wings. Natalie didn't exhale until she felt Travis place the binder gently on the table and slide it toward the judge. "Exhibit 14 through 27, Your Honor," he said with precision, "including internal correspondence, metadata logs, and performance evaluation comparisons." Opposing counsel stood immediately. Your Honor, we object. These documents were not submitted through discovery. The court has already ruled. Sinclair cut him off. Objection noted, but overruled. Proceed. It was a subtle moment, but profound. For the first time, Natalie had the court's full attention. Travis began walking through the digital trail like a surgeon with a scalpel. The courtroom screens flickered to life, displaying emails laced with racially coded language, client fit, image alignment, and branding concerns that had been used to justify sidelining Natalie. The contrast between glowing performance reviews and the abrupt downturn after a change in management spoke louder than any testimony. A hush fell so deep that even the clicking of a pen felt intrusive. Natalie sat upright, watching as her reality was finally being acknowledged in pixels and proof. Even Judge Sinclair, once unmoved, now scribbled notes quickly. The opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, no longer smirking. The tide was turning, not with fire, but with fact. And in the quiet storm that followed, Natalie realized something powerful. They weren't just hearing her now, they were listening. The truth didn't arrive with thunder, it crept in, quiet and undeniable, like smoke under a locked door. As Travis Monroe clicked to the next slide, revealing a chain of internal memos unearthed just days ago, the mood in the courtroom curdled from the tension into alarm. On screen were damning lines of corporate correspondence from executives at Argento Strategies, referring to campaign targets using phrases like avoid overly urban-facing staff, and realign optics for voter compatibility. Though couched in coded language, the intent was unmistakable. This wasn't just about Natalie Vaughn's career. It was about a system that had profited from racial erasure. But Travis wasn't done. He walked to the evidence table and pulled out a folder stamped confidential. Your Honor, he said, voice carefully measured, this next piece of evidence comes from a whistleblower, an internal strategist from Argento who came forward following Ms. Vaughn's removal from this courtroom earlier today. The judge's eyes narrowed. Name? She's appearing via secure video testimony under federal witness protection, Travis replied, due to safety concerns. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as a screen flickered to life. The image stabilized, revealing a woman in her late 20s with tired eyes and a strained expression. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back hastily, as if she'd rushed to record this the moment courage overtook fear. My name is Sabrina Navarro, she said. I worked under the senior communications team at Argento for 4 years. I saw the reports Natalie wrote. I saw the changes in how she was treated after speaking up. But I stayed silent. Until now. The courtroom hung on her every word. Sabrina outlined how Natalie's warnings about discriminatory practices were buried, how leadership retaliated by excluding her from key accounts, and how senior executives actively encouraged demographic targeting strategies that intentionally manipulated public perception by race and socioeconomic status. They framed it as smart campaigning, she said, her voice cracking, but it was calculated exclusion. Natalie wasn't fired because she underperformed. She was fired because she tried to stop it. The opposing counsel jumped to his feet. This is hearsay. There's no proof she... Sit down, counselor, Judge Sinclair said sharply. Her gavel stayed untouched. Her glare was enough. Sabrina continued. When I heard Natalie was being silenced in court, I knew I had to speak up. What they're doing isn't just unethical, it's dangerous. As her testimony ended, the courtroom remained silent. No one moved. The weight of her words hung in the air like a blade waiting to drop. Natalie sat motionless, stunned not just by the validation, but by the scale of what her case had uncovered. This wasn't just about one job. It wasn't even about one company. It was about a corporate structure built to quietly marginalize, manipulate, and maintain power. And now that truth, ugly, undeniable, and no longer hidden, was finally out in the open. The reckoning had begun. For a long moment after Sabrina Navarro's testimony faded from the screen, Courtroom 4B remained utterly silent. The kind of silence that signals a shift, not in tone, but in power. Opposing counsel, once smug and unbothered, now sat rigid in his chair, his fingers frozen above his notepad as if unsure whether to write or run. The color had drained from his face. The evidence was no longer just circumstantial or emotionally compelling. It was devastating. Natalie Vaughn's claims of racial bias were now reinforced by an insider with direct knowledge, damning memos, and the courage to defy the very machine she had once served. Across the room, Judge Margot Sinclair adjusted her glasses with more care than before. The sternness remained, but a deep, contemplative frown had taken hold. She leaned forward slightly, fingers laced together beneath her chin as though finally recognizing the magnitude of what had unfolded in her courtroom. She flipped through her notes, pausing over highlighted entries, and glanced back up, eyes now sharper, calculating. The balance had tipped, and everyone in the room could feel it. "Does the defense have any rebuttal?" she asked, her voice low and pointed, no longer perfunctory. The lead attorney for Argento Strategies rose slowly, as though the floor beneath him might give way. His confidence was gone, replaced by thinly veiled panic. "Your Honor," he began, clearing his throat, "we request a brief recess to—" "To what?" Sinclair cut in. "To find an explanation for emails written by your client's executive board, or to respond to a federal whistleblower who provided corroborating testimony under oath." The lawyer's mouth opened, then closed again. He swallowed hard. "We weren't aware of these materials until this morning. We would like time to verify their authenticity." Travis Monroe stood before the judge could speak. "All documents have been verified with matching metadata, Your Honor. The DOJ has copies. Every timestamp, every header, every IP address has been reviewed." Sinclair raised an eyebrow at the defense table. "Still requesting a recess?" The opposing counsel nodded stiffly, voice dry. "Yes, Your Honor. 30 minutes. "So ordered." She banged her gavel once, then pointedly added, "Use it wisely." As the courtroom emptied in a low hum of whispers and sideways glances, Natalie remained seated, her body motionless but her mind racing. Everything was shifting. She could see it in the nervous way the defense huddled near the exit, whispering furiously. She could hear it in the rapid-fire clicks of reporters' phone keyboards. She could feel it, the crumbling of the wall she'd been beating her fists against for months. Travis leaned in, barely containing a grin. They're cornered. The DOJ is watching. And public opinion just detonated in our favor. Natalie stared straight ahead, gripping the binder now more like a torch than a shield. For the first time since walking into that courtroom, she wasn't just defending herself. She was winning. Miles away from the courthouse, in a sleek glass-paneled boardroom atop one of DCE's most powerful high-rises, Argento Strategies was unraveling. The conference table, once a symbol of control and strategy, was now littered with coffee cups, scattered documents, and the unmistakable tension of corporate panic. The CEO, Elliot Granger, silver-haired and usually unflappable, stood at the head of the table staring at the large screen on the wall, a live stream of Natalie Vaughn's case, which had now gone viral. A red banner from a national news outlet ran beneath the footage. DOJ eyes Argento Strategies in potential civil rights investigation. The silence in the room was punctuated only by the furious tapping of a legal advisor's laptop and the CEO's sharp intake of breath. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Granger muttered, his voice low and dangerous. She was a mid-level brand manager with a grievance, not a national headline. "She had proof," said Cynthia Marsh, the firm's head of communications, who looked far less composed than usual. "And now she has a whistleblower, Sabrina Navarro's testimony. It's out. It's everywhere." One of the junior executives dared to speak. "We could still issue a statement, maybe call it a misunderstanding, company miscommunication, poor documentation, something." "Stop!" snapped the company's general counsel, slamming a hand on the table. "This is not a PR cleanup. This is a legal catastrophe. The DOJ is watching. The White House may be involved. And if those emails are admissible and authentic, we're looking at more than one lawsuit. We're looking at systemic discrimination investigations, federal level, possibly class action." Granger ran a hand over his face, pacing now. "How the hell did this get past compliance? We've had complaints before, sure, but they've always been manageable." Cynthia nodded grimly. "Not anymore. Employees are speaking out on social media. One of our clients just pulled out of a major deal. Hashtag I worked at Argento is trending on 3 platforms." Granger's jaw clenched. "Find out who else has NDAS. Lock them down." The general counsel shot him a look. "That's a terrible idea. If we're seen suppressing people now, it'll blow up even worse. We're being watched. Closely. Then what do you suggest? Start negotiating. Apology, settlement, reforms, real ones. If we move fast, we might keep DOJ from issuing a formal charge. Another executive leaned forward cautiously. Do we think Vaughn wants a settlement, or is she going all the way? Everyone looked at each other, no one answering, because they all knew. This wasn't just a lawsuit to Natalie Vaughn anymore, it was a reckoning. As panic thickened in the room like smoke, Granger sat down heavily in his leather chair. The mighty Argento brand, so careful, so powerful, so untouchable, was no longer behind closed doors. It was exposed, unraveled, and bleeding credibility by the hour. One thing was clear. Natalie Vaughn hadn't just threatened their bottom line. She had shaken their empire to its foundation. The tension in the negotiation room was electric, like a thunderstorm waiting to explode. The long mahogany table sat between two warring camps. On one side, Natalie Vaughn, composed yet fierce, her binder of evidence now worn at the edges from weeks of gripping it like a lifeline. On the other, Argento Strategies' top legal brass, flanked by their PR consultant and a visibly frazzled HR director. At the head of the table sat a stone-faced liaison from the Department of Justice, silent but ever watchful. His presence a reminder that this was no longer just a private dispute. It was a national reckoning. "We're offering a full settlement," said Diane Keller, the lead attorney for Argento. Her voice was flat, professional, but her eyes flickered with urgency. Back pay, damages, legal costs, 7 figures. In exchange for a mutual non-disclosure agreement, withdrawal of all public claims, and no admission of wrongdoing by Argento Strategies. Natalie didn't move. She didn't even blink. She had expected this. Money wrapped in silence, a golden gag order. Travis Monroe shifted slightly beside her, his hand resting calmly on the binder. "And the reforms?" he asked coolly. Keller cleared her throat. "Voluntary internal review, DEI training. We'll consider a public statement expressing regret." "Regret?" Natalie's jaw tightened. "Regret for what, exactly?" she asked, voice even but sharp enough to draw blood. "For firing me when I uncovered racial profiling in your client campaigns? For blacklisting me in the industry? Or for getting caught?" The air thickened. One of the PR consultants began scribbling notes furiously. "We understand this has been emotional," Keller said, attempting diplomacy. "But this offers more than fair. You could move on, protect your daughter's future, start fresh." That word, move on, landed like a slap. Natalie felt the rage simmer beneath her ribs. Move on from what? From the humiliation, the sleepless nights, from the idea that speaking truth to power was somehow a liability. She looked at the DOJ liaison. "Would a private settlement impact any pending investigations?" He shook his head. "Not necessarily, but the weight your public stance carries right now, it's influencing real policy discussions, and real people." Natalie's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. She thought of Maya, of the life they had pieced together from the rubble of corporate betrayal. She thought of Sabrina Navarro, risking everything to speak up. And she thought of the thousands watching, those who had been passed over, silenced, gaslit, erased. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Keller. "Here's what I want," she said, voice steady. "Binding structural reforms, third-party audits, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, quarterly oversight reports submitted to the DOJ, no vague regrets, no buried truths." Keller opened her mouth, but Natalie didn't let her speak. "Or I walk back into that courtroom tomorrow and we take this all the way, and this time I won't be walking out." A beat of silence. Then Keller nodded slowly. "We'll go back to the board." Natalie leaned back. She'd made her choice. Justice, not hush money. Change, not comfort. And now the clock was ticking, for everyone. The courthouse had begun to quiet for the evening. The echo of footsteps faded into silence, and the marble floors, now mostly cleared of the day's traffic, reflected the last golden streaks of sunlight spilling through the tall windows. Natalie Vaughn stood near the vending machines outside courtroom 4B, her binder tucked under her arm, her body still vibrating with the tension of everything that had transpired. She had just walked out of a negotiation room where she refused to be bought into silence. Now she waited, uncertain of what would come next. That's when she saw him. Sergeant Damon Whitmore, no longer in his stiff patrol stance, but walking toward her without the practiced authority she had grown used to. His uniform jacket was unbuttoned, his expression unsure, his usual presence subdued. For a long moment he simply stood across from her as if unsure whether he even had the right to speak. "I heard about the settlement meeting," he said finally, voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "Word spreads fast around here." Natalie raised an eyebrow, cautious but composed. "Did you come to deliver more instructions, Sergeant?" He shook his head. "I came to say I'm sorry." That caught her off guard, not because she didn't think he was capable of remorse, but because she hadn't expected it to come so soon. Or at all. "I followed orders," he continued, looking down briefly. "That's what I kept telling myself. The judge said, 'Remove you,' and I did. But I've replayed that moment over and over. And I realized something. I didn't question why. I just acted. I treated you like a problem instead of a person." Natalie didn't speak right away. The hallway hummed with a distant HVAC drone and the fading click of a typewriter in some clerk's office. She studied him. This man who had dragged her from her own hearing without asking why she was fighting so hard to stay. Now he stood before her, not as an enforcer, but as a man caught in the slow burn of his own awakening. "I don't need your apology," she said finally, voice level. "But I appreciate it." He nodded slowly. "I'm not proud of how I handled it. You didn't deserve that, and I want you to know. I've asked for a transfer." Natalie's brow furrowed. "To where?" "The Community Outreach Division," he replied. "Somewhere I might actually listen instead of just react." A long silence stretched between them, thick with what wasn't said. How many women like her had been silenced by men like him, not out of malice, but out of unchallenged loyalty to power? "I hope you mean that," she said. "I do," he said, his voice steady now. "You made me think. You made this whole place think." As he turned to leave, Natalie stood a little taller. Maybe this wasn't closure. But it was something. Not all apologies undo the past, but sometimes they crack the door open to something better. The morning of the final hearing dawned gray and heavy, as if the city itself held its breath. Natalie Vaughn stood once again on the courthouse steps, but this time she didn't feel like the same woman who had walked them weeks ago, battered by doubt, gripping her binder like armor. Today, the binder was gone, replaced by a sleek folder containing the historic settlement agreement. A document that bore her name alongside sweeping commitments to corporate reform, oversight, and public accountability. Behind her, a modest group of supporters and media lingered, their signs less urgent now, but still proud. "We believe, Natalie." Truth is power. Somewhere in that crowd, her daughter Maya watched quietly, camera in hand, recording a moment she'd never forget. Inside courtroom 4B, the mood was nothing like before. The tension had given way to an odd calm, the eye of a storm after its destruction. Judge Margot Sinclair entered with her usual severity, but her robe felt less imposing, her gaze more measured. This was no longer a battle of wills. It was an official conclusion, a record of what had changed. Natalie took her seat beside Travis Monroe, who offered her a quiet nod of solidarity as they awaited the judge's words. "The matter of Vaughn versus Argento Strategies has reached a negotiated resolution," Sinclair began, her gavel resting lightly in her palm. "We are here to enter the terms of the agreement into the official record and determine that both parties accept the outcome in good faith." The lead counsel for Argento stood and confirmed the settlement. He looked drained, as though the weeks of public scrutiny and legal fallout had aged him. Gone was the arrogance, replaced by the careful deference of someone who had been forced to listen, for once. Then the judge turned to Natalie. "Ms. Vaughn, do you believe this agreement adequately addresses your claims and concerns?" The room held its breath. Natalie stood slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer. Her voice, when it came, was clear and resolute. "I do, Your Honor," she said. "This agreement isn't just for me. It's for everyone who's ever been passed over, silenced, or told their experience didn't matter. These reforms are a start, not the end, but I believe we've taken the first real step towards something better." Judge Sinclair gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, her gavel striking once with finality. "Then it is so ordered." The courtroom exhaled. It was done. As reporters surged outside for statements, Natalie remained still for a moment, savoring the quiet. She had been removed, dismissed, humiliated, But now her voice had been carved into the public record, an echo no system could bury. And as she stepped into the sunlight, Maya rushed forward, throwing her arms around her mother. "You didn't just win, Mom," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "You changed everything." Natalie smiled, eyes shimmering. Not everything, but enough to make the next fight easier. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. Weeks had passed since the gavel fell in Courtroom 4B, but the aftershocks of Natalie Vaughn's case continued to ripple outward. Unexpected, unstoppable, and far-reaching. What began as a single woman's fight for justice had grown into a movement. The settlement, now public record, had become a touchstone for conversations in boardrooms, classrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms alike. Argento Strategies, once an untouchable powerhouse of political influence, had been thrust into a new era, one not of reinvention but reckoning. Shareholders demanded oversight, clients terminated contracts, and the promised reforms, quarterly diversity audits, third-party compliance reviews, and the appointment of an ethics officer, were already underway. The old regime, once smug and dismissive, had been forced into transparency, but the most powerful change was quieter, more human. Natalie began receiving emails from strangers across the country, women who had been pushed out, ignored, or punished for speaking up. Men who had witnessed injustice and stayed silent, now asking how they could help. A high school student in Chicago wrote, "I didn't know someone like me could change something so big." Thank You Natalie saved each message in a folder called Echoes. Social media still buzzed with the hashtag #Vaughn verdict, now synonymous with corporate accountability and courage under pressure. One viral video showed Maya, standing proudly beside her mother outside the courthouse, telling a reporter, "She didn't just win her case, she made them listen." It had over 1 million views. Natalie declined most interviews, preferring to let her actions and the reforms speak. But behind the scenes, she was already building something new. With Travis Monroe's guidance, she launched an initiative, the Vaughn Project, a nonprofit offering legal resources, workplace advocacy training, and whistleblower protections for underrepresented professionals in high-risk industries. Former Argento intern Sabrina Navarro, now hailed as a modern-day hero, joined as the organization's first director of integrity, working remotely and anonymously for her safety, but pouring her energy into systemic change. Even the courthouse felt different. A new set of judicial guidelines regarding courtroom removals and racial bias in legal proceedings was quietly implemented, spearheaded, in part by none other than Sergeant Damon Whitmore. Having transferred to the courthouse's newly formed Community Relations Unit, he now trained new officers on the importance of discretion, equity, and the human cost of blind compliance. No longer hiding behind protocol, he had chosen to do the harder thing: learn, change, and act. One rainy afternoon, Natalie sat at her kitchen table, sorting through a fresh stack of letters, thank yous, media requests, and even a commendation from the Department of Justice for her role in exposing discriminatory practices. Maya, now home from school, curled beside her on the couch reading a textbook on civil rights history. "Mom," she asked suddenly, "do you think this is what Grandma would have wanted?" Natalie smiled softly, eyes wet but steady. "I think it's what she started. I just picked up the thread." Outside, the rain broke just enough for a ray of sunlight to pierce through, and as Natalie stood by the window, watching the droplets glisten on the glass, she felt it. Not the end of a battle, but the beginning of a legacy. The ripples had only just begun. In today's world where systemic inequality and workplace discrimination still persist behind polished walls and corporate statements, Natalie Vaughn's story feels strikingly relevant. Many individuals, especially women, people of color, and whistleblowers, are silenced not through threats, but through policies, power plays, and quiet retaliation. Natalie's refusal to back down, even when humiliated and dismissed, mirrors the bravery required of anyone who dares to confront injustice from within. Her fight reminds us that true progress isn't achieved through silence or settlement alone, but through accountability, reform, and relentless truth-telling. The lesson we can take from Natalie's journey is this: standing up for what's right may come at a cost, but staying silent often costs even more. Change doesn't begin with applause, it begins with resistance. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be erased. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.